Empathy involves the ability to understand the feelings of another person. You don't have to have the same experience, emotion. That's sympathy, right? The same pathos. But empathy is the ability to understand, even if you don't share the same experience of the other person, you still can understand it. Now, Jesus, if Jesus is God the Son, if he's perfect God, he should presumably have perfect empathy, the perfect ability to understand the pain and the suffering of another person. With that in mind, let's turn to Luke chapter 2, the very well-known pericope or story, self-contained story in the life of Jesus, pertaining to the time when he was in the temple, beginning in verse 41 of Luke 2. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw this, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Okay, the one thing I want to kind of set aside in our discussion and reflection in this video is what is clearly the messianic and high Christological framework of this passage, that it is establishing a unique relationship that Jesus has to God as his Father, and that he has a unique self-understanding already emerging at the age of 12 with respect to that. And so this is a very, very important story for that reason. But again, I want to set that aside, and I want to just consider the question of empathy. When my daughter was about 3 or 4 years old, we were visiting family in Colorado. And she got frustrated with me at one point and she stormed off. And then we went on and we were doing our thing. And then we called out for her probably half an hour later and couldn't hear from her. She didn't respond. I shouted again, like I shouted, and then I screamed at the top of my lungs, calling out for my daughter, and there was no response, just silence in the house. In a moment of panic, we suddenly thought maybe she left the house and she walked away. She like ran away from home, as it were. And so we went out and looked in the neighborhood and couldn't find her anywhere. Got back, and by this time I am in maximal panic mode. And we called the police department in Fort Collins in Colorado, and they came out to look for my daughter who was missing. I couldn't process, I couldn't put thoughts together. This is the way that my mind was working in that moment, in that time when my daughter was missing at the age of 4. There was a construction site next to the house at this time, and I was right away thinking that my daughter had been murdered by construction workers, because that's just the kinds of thoughts that come into your mind when you're in panic mode. The police started by saying, "Let's do a sweep of the house." And so they start going through the house. And then I hear the police call out, "Sir, come here." When I heard that, what went into my mind was that the police were calling out the window to some construction worker who was looking suspicious and was covered in blood. And so I was already thinking at that point, my daughter's been murdered. She's dead. She's gone. And I was just like stunned, the anguish, the torment, the vulnerability, the horror of that experience. And then I heard the voice again, "Sir, please come here." And suddenly it clicked and I came back to reality and I realized he was calling me. And I came upstairs and lo and behold, my daughter had fallen asleep beneath the bunk bed. And she must have been a deep sleeper because she professed she didn't hear me when I was screaming. And so when we woke her up, she was just fast. She had been fast asleep. I had in that experience about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, where I didn't know where my daughter was. And I was terrified. That is, I'm sure, the single worst hour of my life. We read in this passage that after Jesus's parents have been traveling for a day, they have a revelation, a horrible revelation that he's missing. It's like in the movie Home Alone. Everybody begins to realize that they've left Kevin behind, right? He's back at home and they've gone off to Paris. And here it is in this moment. Jesus's parents realize that they've left him behind. He's back in Jerusalem. When they finally get to Jerusalem and find him in the temple courts, it has been 3 days. Imagine that. Imagine going to sleep every night, not knowing where your 12-year-old child is, waking up in the morning with, again, this sense of anguish, of pain, of suffering, of fear, of horror, of vulnerability. And in that moment, the words of Jesus's mother come to us. Mary says, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." I hear there the voice of a mother who experienced what I experienced in that hour of desperation, wondering what had happened to her son, fearing that he may not even be alive anymore. And the words of Jesus, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Well, no, she didn't know that. What seems to be problematic in this passage is Jesus seems to show a lack of empathy for his mother and his father, for clearly the anguish and sorrow and fear they had. And even if they should have recognized that he was in the temple for 3 days, the fact that he wouldn't say to them, "I'm sorry that you didn't think to look for me here. I'm sorry that I put you through that. I'm sorry for the fear and the anguish and the vulnerability and the pain and the horror that you've been experiencing." But no, he simply softly chastises them, in essence, saying, "Why did you search for me? Didn't you know where I would be?" And that, again, brings me back to this concept of empathy, of being able to understand and share the feelings of other people, express compassion for them. And in this moment, at least, Jesus' interaction with his parents seems to lack that kind of compassion. It seems to lack empathy. I also think day after day, for 3 days, Jesus has been in the temple and nobody knows there where his parents are. Why would he not have said something? "You know what? My parents, I don't think they would abandon me. They must be looking for me. Could somebody go out and, even if I'm going to sit here and answer questions in the temple, let's still let my parents know that I'm okay." But no, he never even thought to do that, which again suggests a lack of empathy. Now, I'm not going to offer a simple resolution to this problem. What I simply want to point out is that the problem is there, and there probably isn't a simple resolution. I do think that we need to keep in mind the main point of this pericope brings us back to what I set aside at the beginning, which is what it tells us about the God the Son, or Jesus's unique relationship of sonship to the Father, his growing understanding and awareness of his calling, the calling upon his life with his Father and by his Father, his desire to honor his Father, to provide a new understanding of God's law in God's temple. But even with all that set aside and recognizing it is important, we nonetheless have the question that lingers and remains and frankly bothers me, which is that Jesus does seem to show an unsettling lack of empathy for the great suffering of his parents.